Good afternoon. I'm Catherine Epstein, Provost and Dean of the Faculty at Amherst College. Welcome to the final lecture in our series on the history of anti-Black racism in America. This series has been premised on the notion that to understand anti-Black racism today, we need to know much more about the history of anti-Black racism in the United States. In the past few months, we have brought to the college some of the most distinguished Black historians of the African American experience in the United States. We started with Mary Frances Berry and learned about the long struggle of African Americans to receive reparations for slavery. We then heard from Martha Jones about the remarkable role of Black women in the movement for civil rights, as well as how Black women have shaped American political movements more broadly. Then we heard from Khalil Gibran Muhammad on how the white imagination has associated Black Americans with criminality and the deleterious impact of that association. And finally, this afternoon, we are honored to hear from Elizabeth Hinton. Hinton's book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America, documents how the war on poverty that started during the Kennedy administration ultimately turned into a war on crime and drugs. The war on crime and drugs, in turn, led to an extraordinary growth of policing and incarceration among Black Americans. Sadly, however, all the while, the root causes of crime, poverty and inattention to the plight of inner city populations, were left unaddressed. As Hinton painstakingly shows, the call for law and order, the war on crime and drugs, found consensus among both Republican and Democratic administrations. Indeed, it was Senators Edward Kennedy and Joe Biden who introduced legislation that eventually led Congress to pass the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984, widely seen as the beginning of the war on drugs. The bipartisan consensus around law and order is yet another marker of how deeply anti-Black racism pervades American society. It is, of course, one explanation for Trump's electoral strength in the recent election. All this suggests just how much work we still need to do to understand anti-Black racism, past and present, in the United States. Thank you, Professor Hinton, for being with us today and for illuminating such important recent historical trends. As our lecture series draws to a close, we owe a huge thanks to Jen Mannion, Associate Professor of History at Amherst. Jen developed this lecture series, invited our amazing guests, and has also organized parallel events to the main lecture. Each speaker has held a session with a class of Amherst College students. Following each lecture, Jen has also organized hour-long discussion meetings for staff, faculty, and students. Participants have read the speaker's work as well as related articles. I want to thank everyone who is here this afternoon, but also those of you who have participated in one or more of the discussion meetings. Jen, thank you for your incredible work in organizing this series and thereby helping us all to gain a better understanding of anti-Black racism in the United States. And before turning this over to Jen, I would like to thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. This lecture series is supported by a grant from the Mellon Foundation intended to support the cultivation of public scholarship in the humanities at Amherst College. Jen?
Thank you, Provost Epstein. Elizabeth Hinton is Associate Professor in the Department of History and the Department of African American Studies at Yale, with a secondary appointment as Professor of Law at the Law School. Hinton's research focuses on the persistence of poverty, racial inequality, and urban violence in the 20th century United States. She is considered one of the nation's leading experts on criminalization and policing. Her path-breaking book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America, was published by Harvard University Press in 2016. Hinton examines the implementation of federal law enforcement programs beginning in the mid-1960s that transformed domestic social policies and laid the groundwork for the expansion of the US prison system. In revealing the links between the rise of the American carceral state and earlier anti-poverty programs, Hinton presents Ronald Reagan's war on drugs not as a sharp policy departure, but rather as the full realization of a shift towards surveillance and confinement that began during the Johnson administration. Before joining the Yale faculty, Hinton was a professor in the Department of History and the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. She spent 2 years as a postdoctoral scholar in the Michigan Society of Fellows, an assistant professor at the Department of Afro-American in the pages of the Journal of American History, the Journal of Urban History, the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Boston Review, the Nation, and Time. She also co-edited The New Black History, revisiting the Second Reconstruction with the late historian Manny Marable. I have been a big fan of Dr. Hinton's work over the years, especially her 2015 essay in a special issue in the Journal of American History called The War Within Our Own Boundaries, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and the Rise of the Carceral State. This essay highlights the key arguments of her path-breaking book that followed. I teach her work regularly, and I have to say for myself that after reading it, I had one of those aha moments where the rise of mass incarceration finally made sense. Dr. Hinton brought together so many missing pieces to the puzzle, none more provocative than the now well-substantiated claim that progressive Democrats actually partnered with conservative Republicans in the making of mass incarceration in the US. I am thrilled that Dr. Hinton has joined us this evening and will be sharing some of her new research in a talk entitled Criminalization, Inequality, and the Stakes of 2020.
Thank you so much, Jen and Provost Epstein, for that introduction, and also for inviting me to participate in the lecture series on anti-Black racism, especially coming at the end of such distinguished colleagues whose work I admire, including yours, Professor Mannion, and also to Austin Hewitt. Thank you for helping to handle the logistics, and of course, all of you for coming. I so wish that we could be in person, but I'm happy to speak with you under these circumstances. Nonetheless, it's truly an honor to be here. What an intense and crazy year 2020 has been. We now have the election behind us for the most part, but the virus is surging and continues to unmask many other viruses in America. And of course, this summer, we witnessed the largest mass mobilization in American history, with millions of people protesting anti-Black racism and police violence on the streets of cities in all 50 states and 4,400 some cities worldwide. It started, as many of you I'm sure know, on May 25th, after a devastating incident of police violence with deep historical roots, a white police officer jamming his knee into the neck of 46-year-old George Floyd for nearly 10 minutes as 3 other officers held Floyd's body down on the streets. In his final moments, Floyd, unarmed and in handcuffs, pled for his life and repeatedly informed the officer and the crowd of bystanders that he couldn't breathe. Thousands took to the streets in peaceful protest the night after Floyd died, demanding justice for his life, demanding that this time the officers involved be held fully accountable for their actions. Minneapolis residents, in turn, responded to the buildup of unanswered grievances and the lack of concrete changes to their immediate living conditions, problems of underprotection, intentional segregation, and structural exclusion that have only been exacerbated by COVID-19 by using the available resources at their disposal, throwing rocks, bricks, bottles, and firebombs at buildings, police precincts, and police cruisers, and by taking goods and foods from major retailers such as Target and AutoZone, and then burning these and other institutions like this Arby's to the ground. Police unleashed tear gas and rubber bullets on protesters in response, and the National Guard was deployed. In total this summer, more than 17,000 National Guardsmen patrolled the streets in American cities in 23 states and Washington, D.C. The Trump administration deployed federal troops to DC, Portland, Seattle, Kansas City, Chicago, Albuquerque, Cleveland, Detroit, and Milwaukee under Operation Legend and Operation Diligent Valor. Trump borrowed his law and order presidential campaign rhetoric from Richard Nixon and Make America Great Again from Ronald Reagan. And in the context of mass protests for Black lives in 2020, the not so subtle appeals to white racism and the divisions, the authoritarianism of Trumpism made the election about what kind of country we want the United States to be. will we continue along this undemocratic and misguided policy path that has criminalized racially marginalized groups and the poorest among us for generations? Or will we fulfill finally the unfinished promises of abolition and the abolition of slavery and Jim Crow by supporting the structural transformations and redistributive changes at the national level that tens of millions of people demanded across the United States and the world last summer? In 2019, people of color under 16 were the majority of people in that age group. And by 2050, white people will be the minority. The Trump administration and its supporters in Congress are showing us just how far they will go to keep their power to retain white supremacy in the face of these monumental demographic transformations. These are the problems that have been central to American history and why the types of violence we witnessed this summer have been a nearly perennial occurrence in the United States since the civil rights movement. When Trump tweeted the day after George Floyd died, quote, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, he was quoting Miami Police Chief Walter Headley, who said the same thing at a press conference in 1967 after Miami similarly exploded. We have not seen a wave of urban violence like this since the long, hot summers of Lyndon Johnson's presidency. Between 1964 and 1972, the United States confronted the greatest moment of sustained domestic bloodshed since the Civil War. And clearly, we've been living with the aftershocks of this period since. Every major urban center burned during these 8 years, but the violence was not just a problem in archetypal ghettos like Harlem and Watts, and in majority Black cities like Detroit and Washington, D.C. It could happen in any place where Black residents were denied access to political and economic resources and lived in segregated, unequal conditions. Together, these events caused hundreds of millions of dollars in property damage and shaped the lives of the store owners who found their businesses decimated, the parents who lost their teenage son to riot police, and millions of other Americans in between. Through the rhetoric of our politicians, media coverage, and much of the academic research on the subject, we've become accustomed to refer to these events from Harlem in 1964 to Philadelphia just last month as riots, or what those left of center sometimes referred to as civil disorders. We are then left to view these moments in a historical vacuum as riots, as something meaningless and irrational, devoid of any political motivation, and ultimately criminal. This is the position from which the Trump administration responds to the violence today, and how President Lyndon B. Johnson responded from its inception. Johnson announced following the release of an FBI report on violence that swept 8 cities during the summer of 1964, quote, the riots, as well as other criminal and juvenile delinquency problems in our cities are closely connected. Each riot began with a single incident and was aggravated by hoodlums and habitual lawbreakers, end quote. Johnson dismissed the possibility that these hoodlums shared many of the same grievances as civil rights protesters. 3 years later, Johnson would tell the nation during a televised address delivered in the middle of the unprecedented violence in Detroit in 1967, quote, there is no American right to loot stores or to burn buildings or to fire rifles from rooftops. That is crime. Before this point, riots in the United States had been mostly perpetuated by white vigilante mobs who were hostile to integration and who took justice into their own hands, often with the support of local police. A riotous lynch mob as large as 5,000, many of whom came from out of town, descended on the Black community of Springfield, Illinois in August 1908, randomly destroying Black businesses, driving Black families from their homes, and executing 2 Black men. Mobs in East St. Louis in 1917 made Black wartime factory workers and their families choose between being burned alive or shot to death, among other acts of terrorism, in one of the bloodiest riots of the 20th century. This white supremacist violence only escalated as Black migrants continued to flee the terror of the segregationist South in greater numbers after World War I, searching for better opportunities and safety from the white mob. 25 cities erupted during what is known as the Red Summer of 1919, when white and Black residents fought and killed each other on the streets of Chicago and Washington, D.C. In the rural community of Phillips County, Arkansas, where Black tenant sharecroppers were attempting to unionize, white emergency posses killed at least 200 people. Another 200 would be killed in Tulsa, Oklahoma 2 years later, in what is known as the Greenwood Massacre, carried out by 2,000 white men who were deputized to commit various atrocities against Black residents with the full backing of the county government. And race riots spiked again in major cities during World War II. White supremacist violence continues to pervade American society, although in the post-war period, local police came to assume many of the previous functions of the anti-Black punitive tradition that keeps racial hierarchies in place. When white people no longer appeared to be the driving force behind rioting in the nation's cities and Black collective violence against exploitative and exclusionary institutions surfaced, rioting became associated with criminality and grounded the intensifying clamor for law and order. As President Johnson and others saw it, rioting and crime were two strains of the same disease in Black communities that could only be cured by more police. The McCone Commission determined in its report on the Watts uprising in Los Angeles in August 1965, quote, "These riots were each a symptom of a sickness in the center of our cities." The commission identified the cause of the sickness not as systemic racism, but disintegrating Black families who set in motion a spiral of failure for their children, leading them to a life of crime and welfare dependency. It was the riffraff of the ghetto who fueled the violence, so the theory went. The criminals, the young, the unskilled, the jobless. They rioted, they burned and looted, seeking momentary thrills to break their tedious lives. Such pathological understandings, never a frame through which authorities considered acts of white terrorism, reinforced a sense of general disorder in urban centers and justified lawmakers' decision to enlist the police to manage that disorder. So a proper account of violence in the post-civil rights era depends on our ability not to interpret it not as a wave of criminality, but as a period of sustained insurgency. The violence emerged in response to a moment of tangibly felt racism, a single incident, as Johnson said, most often touched off by a police encounter. But the tens of thousands of Black Americans who participated in this collective violence were rebelling against past harms, past wrongs, and the systems that preserved unequal conditions over generations. Unlike the Black Panthers, the Black Liberation Army, the Weathermen, or other revolutionary groups active during these years, these instinctive community-based rebellions sought concessions from authorities in the areas of unemployment, housing, education, and law enforcement, and a reordering of the status quo so that Black people would no longer be treated as second-class citizens in their city and country. The violence served as a message to the nation that civil rights reform, an unprecedented war on poverty, and nonviolent direct action tactics were inadequate to solve the problem of racial inequality. Something else was needed. Johnson himself recognized in the same July 1967 speech on Detroit, where he linked rioting with crime and disentangled it from civil rights protests, that, quote, "The only genuine long-range solution for what has happened lies in an attack mounted at every level upon the conditions that breed despair and violence." The president's rhetoric indicated that he favored social programs, but in practice, he increasingly looked to law enforcement as a short-term solution to manage the manifestations of these conditions as they appeared through rioting and crime. Other liberals joined Johnson in the shift through the second half of the 1960s as the rebellions increased in intensity alongside the rollout of civil rights legislation and new job training, remedial education, and community action programs, wondering if perhaps the social welfare intervention had gone too far. Viewed as riots, as criminal acts that could only be controlled with law enforcement, Johnson and other authorities never seriously questioned the way the war on crime, launched 1 year after the war on poverty, may have also been culpable for the violence. Instead, they embraced the expansion of American law enforcement as the best strategy to handle race relations moving forward. The decision to respond to the rebellions with police force was not a foregone conclusion, however. Johnson's own advisory commission on civil disorders, known popularly as the Kerner Commission, offered a promising but unpursued alternative to the escalation of policing and incarceration. In its final report of February 1968, which went on to become a national bestseller as a mass market paperback, the commission warned federal policymakers and the nation that absent a massive infusion of public resources promoting greater access to political and economic institutions, quote, sufficient to make a dramatic, visible impact on life in the urban ghetto, a rising proportion of Negroes in disadvantaged city areas might come to look upon the deprivation and segregation they suffer as proper justification to engage in large-scale violence followed by white retaliation. The Kerner Commission's grim forecast came to fruition almost immediately and continues to shape American life to this day. Federal policymakers did not heed the warnings of the Kerner Commission or take seriously what residents told elected officials, newspaper reporters, and researchers about how rebellion could be prevented in the future. nor did authorities take the persistence of rebellion as an indication that the strategy of increasing state surveillance and militarizing crime control forces in Black communities had inflamed the violence that officials wanted to prevent. But the Johnson administration did blame the riots on Black men between the ages of 15 and 24 and developed a new national law enforcement program to target that demographic. When faced with alternatives, lawmakers pursued a punitive path that advanced racial injustice. The rebellions appeared most threatening in the summer of 1967 and in the 137 separate incidents that followed the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968. Our memory of these incidents largely stops there, but the rebellions endured for years to come. Between May 1968 and December 1972, at least 960 segregated Black communities across the United States witnessed 2,326 separate uprisings, the vast majority in mid-sized and smaller cities that journalists and scholars tend to overlook. Most of the violent encounters involving Black residents during this period began in response to the policing of ordinary, everyday activity. Through these 4 years, nearly 40,000 people were arrested, more than 10,000 were injured, and at least 220 people died. Even less recognized in this wave of Black rebellion in the later period are the Latinx Americans who similarly took up violence in an effort to secure equal rights, improve unequal conditions, and challenge the emerging crime control apparatus. At least 200 rebellions were carried out by Latinx residents after King's murder, the majority of them in Puerto Rican communities in the Northeast. Although many state and local officials joined national policymakers in primarily targeting young Black men for new punitive programs after 1965, Latinx communities suffered from increasing levels of police brutality and the shared conditions of mass unemployment, degraded housing, and unequal access to educational resources. Along with Black rebellions, these events should be recognized as part of a much larger political impulse arising from shared grievances among people of color and drawing our attention to the inherent discrimination within American law enforcement and the criminal legal system. The rock throwing, fire setting, and window breaking that emerged in more than 1,000 Black and brown communities during this largely forgotten window happened after President Lyndon Johnson signed the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 into law. Johnson had called the war on crime in March 1965, 1 week after he sent the Voting Rights Act to Congress, beginning an unprecedented investment into local law enforcement that was prompted in large part by the continued problem of Black rebellion. As Americans fought the Vietnam War, federal policymakers ramped up police operations on the home front to battle political radicalism and rebellion, creating a pipeline to deliver Army surplus weapons and technologies to local law enforcement. City officials took advantage of this freshly available federal resource to control Black neighborhoods. In between the launch of the crime war and the enactment of the Safe Streets Act, the federal government spent $20.6 million funding 359 programs that modernized police departments with riot control training programs and with military-grade weapons like AR-15s and M4 carbines, steel helmets, 3-foot batons, masks, armored vehicles, two-way radios, tear gas, and a handful of low-cost police community relations initiatives thrown in for good measure. The Los Angeles Police Department, still recovering from the Watts Rebellion in 1965, received the second largest grant and a helicopter in 1967. Seen as the foot soldiers of the war on crime, as President Johnson called them, the federal government ensured that police, as a counterinsurgent force, would be prepared to face their domestic enemy. Although Black communities had been vulnerable to targeted surveillance, frequent encounters with police, mass arrests, illegal searches, and outright brutality in the century after emancipation, the official launch of the war on crime meant that residents in segregated low-income neighborhoods in big cities like New York, mid-sized cities like Phoenix, and smaller cities like West Point, Georgia, would be patrolled by police departments with an arsenal of riot control equipment at their disposal. By 1970, federal policymakers had allocated some $40 million, or about $300 million in today's dollars, on such equipment for local law enforcement. At the same time, the Safe Streets Act and its $330 million outlay for crime control supported the influx of police officers in urban areas that seemed prone to rebellion. But the strategy of militarizing local police forces and saturating communities of color with police and surveillance failed to have a measurable impact on the crime problem itself in the poorest, most vulnerable urban communities. Even as national crime rates declined significantly in the 1990s, the moment when federal policymakers accelerated the turn towards zero tolerance policing and mass incarceration, In the communities where police and surveillance loom large, Black and brown residents are vulnerable to premature death. In this sense, the wars on crime and drugs and the hundreds of billions of dollars allocated to fight them represent not only gross violations of civil liberties, but are arguably the biggest domestic policy failures in the history of the United States. The large-scale rebellions of the last decades of the 20th and early 21st century, Miami in 1980, Los Angeles in 1992, and Cincinnati in 2001, share many of the same causes and characteristics as the collective violence of the earlier period. But these rebellions and the political violence that followed beginning in the mid-2010s emerged in response to the way policing measures advanced an inherently racist criminal legal system that disproportionately ensnared millions of women and men of color, deepening segregation and inequality in the process. The conditions that bred the police encounters and legal injustices and precipitated the rebellions of 50 years ago and today would not have happened and could have been avoided entirely had national lawmakers and law enforcement authorities decided to respond in a different way to the enlightened protests of the post-civil rights era in both its nonviolent and violent forms. Prevailing interpretations view the rebellions as a break from the nonviolent direct action protest tactics of the civil rights movement. This second reconstruction, which promised to meet the unfulfilled promises of the Civil War and its aftermath, aimed to integrate American society and extend the bounds of citizenship. It secured the right to an education, to shop at certain stores or eat in certain restaurants, and to vote. It made racism no longer acceptable in American public discourse and created a growing Black middle class. But with the war on crime came new forms of social control, and with them, a new form of resistance. As the Reverend Charles Cohen, a prominent activist who preached the politics of armed self-defense and community control in Cairo, Illinois, pointed out, quote, voting rights could not be eaten or made into clothing and shelter. The rising generation that spawned the unrest in segregated urban communities during this period was prepared to take the socioeconomic aims of civil rights protests to their logical conclusion. This generation spent their childhoods witnessing the civil rights movement unfold, and were now approaching adulthood in the era of Black power, emboldened with the kind of courage to meet police violence with violence that perhaps the older generations could not have possessed. Even if they did not participate and often served important roles in calming the violence, many residents resonated with and admired the determination of those who stood up to the forces of anti-Black racism with rocks and fire. As a Black activist in Alexandria, Virginia put it, quote, the expression the youngsters put forth is a deep and hidden expression of older Blacks. The sit-ins, marches, boycotts, voter registration drives, and legal challenges that defined Black politics in the post-war period had not addressed structural inequities or provided protections from the lived realities of police and white supremacist violence. For many Black Americans, the choice seemed to be give up and accept their inferior status in American society or fight back. An older Black resident in York, Pennsylvania, a city which suffered from one of the most devastating rebellions of the era in the summer of 1969, one that involved the twin forces of police violence and white vigilante terror, explained, quote, the cops are out shooting at people or busting heads, and you go down to City Hall and they say they didn't do it, and that's all there is to it. You can't buck City Hall. We've been going to City Hall for years. Somebody's going to have to get hurt. That's all there is to it. If government authorities were unwilling to protect Black residents from police brutality, then self-defense, the politics Black Americans had adopted historically under white terrorism and government complacency in an attempt to create safer conditions in their communities, presented itself as a rational alternative. In addition to serving as a form of protection among the nation's most vulnerable, violence might force local, state, and national politicians to respond with greater urgency to Black residents' demands. As a spokesman for the Hartford Black Caucus declared in 1969, after young Black residents engaged in confrontations with police and damaged nearly 100 buildings with rocks and fire through the summer, quote, the power structure reacts to riots and violence. This is the Black man's only power. By their actions, those who participated in the rebellions argued that violence was a necessary strategy to secure economic access and full civic inclusion for not just Black people, but for all Americans. It can be a struggle to imagine the young people who threw rocks at police or who looted local businesses as political actors, and this bias has influenced the writing of history. Even scholars and activists interested in forms of resistance to systemic racism have been reluctant to take seriously the political nature of Black rebellion. Yet just as much as nonviolent direct action, rebellion presented a way for people of color to express collective solidarity in the face of exploitation, political exclusion, and criminalization. And arguably, the success of the nonviolent direct political action that characterized the civil rights movement and is the guiding principle of protest today depended on the presence of violent direct political action. As Martin Luther King Jr. himself recognized, the power of mass nonviolence rose in part from its ability to suggest the coercive power of violent resistance should demands not be met. Therefore, when we reflect on Black protests, past, present, and future, we should endeavor to see both its violent and nonviolent expressions as entwined forces. And to do that, we should attempt to understand violent rebellion on its own terms as a form of direct political action that has been just as integral to the history of the United States and freedom movements. Both violent and nonviolent traditions have continued to ground movements for social justice. But the violent conditions which have shaped Black life for 4 centuries have made violent responses to those conditions a feature of American life from the very beginning. Indeed, what I've been describing, what happened this summer, and what we voted on exactly 2 weeks ago has been one of the central problems of American history. Slave owners constantly feared that human property would exert their self-defense by escaping, or that groups of enslaved Africans would take revenge on their white masters. Slave patrols, America's first system of organized civilian-based law enforcement, were charged with suppressing potential insurrection by raiding slave dwellings, dispersing gatherings, and patrolling the areas around plantations and towns. These essential duties became the fundamental logics of American policing, maintaining the social order and preventing violent retaliation among oppressed people of color by making them objects of surveillance and control. Under the terms of the Declaration of Independence, enslaved Africans were justified in rebelling against the forces that kept them in bondage. The contradiction between the American founding values of liberty and equality and the governing principles of racism and exploitation sustained the conditions that bred rebellion in the early republic and in contemporary America. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration and owner of more than 600 slaves in his lifetime, embodied this contradiction perhaps better than any other. As he wrote of rebellion in 1785's Notes in the State of Virginia, and I'm just going to read the last lines, which are the most famous ones. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that considering numbers, nature, and natural means only, a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation is among possible events. Jefferson went on to observe in this off-cited passage that the exchange of situation was on the horizon, that the slaves were rising from the dust. And he hoped that their total emancipation would be realized, quote, with the consent of the masters rather than by their extirpation. Eventually, Jefferson knew the violence of racial oppression would come back to haunt the nation that was built upon that oppression. And he hoped that when it did, the ruling elite would fix the contradictions that had cursed America from the beginning. To ignore them would bring peril in the future. Jefferson cast Black rebellion as a self-fulfilling prophecy that he and other founders had set in motion, a menace that would remain as long as racial hierarchies were preserved and state violence mobilized to preserve them. Paraphrasing Jefferson some 180 years later, Lyndon Johnson remarked to the rebellions that followed the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., quote, what did you expect? I don't know why we're so surprised. When you put your foot on a man's neck and hold him down for 300 years, and then you let him up, what's he going to do? He's going to knock your block off. Despite their awareness of, and even sympathy for, the causes of rebellion, neither Jefferson nor Johnson, limited by their own racism, were willing to lead the nation in righting the wrongs of history. They left it to future generations, and by doing so, ensured that inequality and violence would continue to tarnish American life. Had policymakers and officials at all levels of government taken the rebellions as an opportunity to seriously listen to residents' demands and reconsider the purpose and function of police, the negative consequences of the punitive approach to urban problems might have been avoided entirely. The most important lesson from the rebellions, that police violence precipitates community violence, escaped policymakers and the scholars they consulted. Instead, led by the national government, authorities allocated billions of taxpayer dollars into the wars on crime and drugs and gangs and mass incarceration that only seemed to make the problem worse on all sides. Rather than contend with underlying causes, officials further criminalized entire communities where unrest materialized for the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st. Taken together, the history of this violence demonstrates that patrolling low-income neighborhoods with outside forces does not effectively control crime. In fact, It establishes a dynamic where residents and officers view each other as the enemy, rendering both sides less safe. Officials overlooked the fact that young Black people were, and continue to be, much more likely to suffer harm or death with police lingering in their community, either by each other or by an officer whose job is ostensibly to protect them. Michael Brown, who was fatally shot by Ferguson police 8 days after he graduated high school, is such a legacy of this policy path, sustained over 5 decades. And Brown's death in 2014 sparked a renewal of violent political rebellion the United States had not confronted since the long, hot summers of Johnson's presidency. Back then, residents demanded policies to address state-sanctioned violence, mass unemployment, deplorable public schools, and inhumane housing conditions. Policymakers and officials gave them policing, surveillance, and prisons instead, turning mass criminalization into the engine of racial inequality in the aftermath of Jim Crow. And in doing so, authorities left the central contradiction of American society unresolved and recast its most racive and repressive elements in a new guise. It remains to be seen where this criminalization, this mass supervision and imprisonment will poison American society even further. We as a nation still fail to reckon with the wisdom Martin Luther King Jr. prophetically offered toward the end of his life, one that recalls Thomas Jefferson's own warnings, that, quote, social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention. There is no other answer. Constructive social change will bring certain tranquility. Evasions will merely encourage turmoil. More than a half century after King's insights and more than 200 years after Jefferson's, it is clear that America will continue to catch the fires of rebellion until the structures of racial inequality are finally dismantled and the police are no longer empowered by authorities to manage the material consequences of conditions that are beyond their control. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much. You basically answered all of my questions. So right now I'm trying to decide whether to ask them anyway and kind of have you elaborate on some of your points. But actually, I'm going to go right to the questions from the audience because there is a question that I think touches on one of your last points that you just made. And it really is about the role of police in Black communities. And I'm just going to read right from the prompt. This person said, some Black communities would apparently like to reduce police presence, while others would like more and better policing. Can you help us understand why?
Yeah, so I think part of the key is the better policing, right? I mean, we shouldn't be surprised that that residents in communities that are experiencing high levels of crime want better protection. And this is a dynamic that that I actually have explored with colleagues of mine who also work on issues of policing and crime control, the political scientist Veshla Weaver and the historian Julie Kohler-Hausman. And we called this this concept selective hearing in a New York Times op-ed. And basically what we argue is that that Black Americans, in calling for more and better police, right, that is usually tied in with a lot of the kinds of demands that I was talking about that animated both nonviolent and violent political rebellion, right? Socioeconomic investments into under-resourced communities, more money spent on education, decent housing, basic social welfare services, and a more kind of imaginative view of what crime prevention looks like. And so despite, when residents call for better policing, right, policymakers tend to hear more policing. And so one of the things that's one way we can think about it is that of all the demands, predating the 60s, but in, the post-war United States, that Black communities and communities of color have called for, the thing that they've gotten most of are police surveilling and incarceration, right? Very rarely are residents in overpoliced and underprotected communities just calling for more police, but instead that is the demand that gets taken up. So in that sense, that's why we call this selective hearing, because policymakers have not heard or responded to the suite of things that that Black residents in these communities have asked for.
Thank you. I actually want to draw on that op-ed because it's very insightful. And I wonder if, building on what you just said, if we could kind of connect the dots from that argument to what is defund the police? When people, what is that movement about? I feel like you're right there. So I'm just wondering if if your answer, anyway.
Right. So this, I mean, again, we can go back to the Kerner Commission, and that's why I think that that report is actually so important, because again, it's these like contesting visions of how should we respond to basically, the material manifestations of poverty and racial inequality as they appear in crime and violence or social harm, and and instead of making an investment right there in the 60s, right, in full employment program or job creation programs, instead the federal government decided to invest in essentially a job creation program for police. What defund the police is doing is essentially asking us to rethink these investments, and that's one of the reasons why I emphasize so much. I think the big takeaway from my first book and my research is that the hundreds of billions of dollars that we've invested into crime control programs at all levels of government have not made a measurable have not actually kept communities safer, have not actually successfully prevented violence and social harm in these communities. And so now it's time for us to maybe go back to what the Kerner Commission recommended and think about a different set of investments that we can make into communities. I see the best kind of way to foster public safety to prevent crime in the future is not to put more police on the streets to look for potential suspects, but instead to think about how we can invest in educational opportunities, how we can get people jobs, how we can make sure that that people live in houses that don't have rats and roaches running through their beds. To me, this is what public safety is about, and this is in the long run a much more effective use of taxpayer dollars that can actually improve lives rather than just criminalize, punish, and incarcerate people.
I find this just so insightful and helpful because talking heads and, well-meaning, interested people, I feel like people have just been going around in circles all summer, like, well, what's the answer to police violence? And is it this, is it, which like lever do I pull on first? And what you just said, and, what you said in that op-ed is not just that, yeah, it's about socioeconomic inclusion, but it's not just that we're saying that now. You have this incredible example of historical contingency where a lot of people just like us had this same conversation in the 1960s. We're reading and talking and listening and trying to figure out what's the right thing. And they made a terrible decision. And so like, what is to like, how can this moment of incredible upheaval and potential transformation in 2020, which is intensified for all the reasons that you laid out in the beginning, how can 2020, what policymakers and liberals do, not reproduce the errors of the 1960s and 70s?
So I think actually this goes to the earlier question about about defund, right? I mean, and it's not that is thinking about it as making a different set of investments or divest, invest. I think in some ways is less polarizing than defund, but really it's making a whole different set of investments, because when we every time this happens, when we think about reform and really since the Carter administration, urban policy and crime control policy have been completely intertwined. We don't really have we can't imagine how to approach urban problems outside of policing functions. And so much of this is getting beyond that framework. It's really disappointing when, I think it was maybe in July or August when Joe Biden's response essentially to the protest was a $330 million investment into more police training and more body cams and equipment. And again, one of the things that our history shows us is that investing in training and equipment is always the response to these problems and always the response to police violence, and that hasn't worked. And so one of the things that we need to begin doing is making investments into communities themselves and into vibrant community organizations that are addressing these problems and that have been either forced to rely on crowdsourcing funds or private money in order to survive because so much of public funds are diverted, especially in low-income urban communities, to law enforcement, where in many of these places, the police budget is more than half the municipal budget, which eats up, of course, many fundamental social welfare programs. So yeah, I mean, I think the first step is to think of to no longer, we don't need to spend more money on police departments at this point. We need to rethink public safety in terms of how we can actually empower community members to keep their own neighborhood safe.
Thank you. I have a question about police unions. Someone is wondering what role you see police unions playing in the war on crime and what changes in regarding those unions would need to happen for us to see some of the dramatic changes that are necessary.
Yeah, so that's a really tough question, especially because so often police chiefs, even chiefs who say that they want to make progressive reforms, kind of always blame the unions as a stopgap from doing so. And in part, I think that we need bolder police chiefs and policies that will actually change the bargaining power of unions. I mean, so much of the lack of accountability and the lack of enforcement of police violence that we've seen, certainly in the last 5 or 6 years, has to do with the fact that police unions have all of these safeguards for their members, and so it's really, really difficult to actually actively pursue officers who have records of excessive use of force or misconduct. And so, part of it is we of course don't want to prevent people from unionizing, but we've got to rethink, what these unions mean in terms of, and really the threat that that many of the power of these unions pose to the safety of the community themselves. And so, I think we need a new set of policies that will be able to combat some of the ways in police union power, but also police chiefs who will be bold and brave enough to take on the unions and enacting more progressive and a set of more progressive and enlightening set of policing measures.
To that end, I have a question. Someone is wondering do we have any good examples? Are there any cities or police unions that are actually doing this well, that have responded this summer in more progressive ways and more effective ways for those of us who care about racial justice?
So I think, again, in part because of the power of the unions and the culture of policing, it's a struggle. It's been really tough. Like even in Minneapolis, as a city council did take strides to initially defund the police and think about a new community-based model. Through the fall and in months since, in part because of pressure from the police department, and in part also because in response to the protests and a kind of sense of anti-police climate, officers have withdrawn, right? They've withdrawn from communities and said, well, I don't want to, I don't want to, I'm not going to, interfere in certain situations. They become almost paralyzed in the sense that they're like, well, if I respond to certain calls in a certain way, I might be accused as racist. And so in Minneapolis, we've seen in a way the kind of earlier push towards defund in some senses not actually materialize in the way that city council members themselves and certainly activists would have envisioned. But I do think that there are some promising police departments who are making important reforms. I've, for the past 4 years or so, I've been working with who I consider to be probably the most progressive police chief in the country, and that's Eric Jones in Stockton, California. And as part of a Department of Justice program that started during the Obama administration, largely in response to the unrest in Ferguson and Baltimore and other cities, and the kind of spate of police killings that we became aware of through videos and social media during this period. Selected 6 cities to implement procedural justice and to try to improve trust and relations between police and residents of color in particular. And in Stockton, actually developed one of the more, I think, bold approaches as part of the national initiative, and conducted what they call racial reconciliation, which is kind of problematic because there was, we could argue that there's never been really conciliation between communities of color and police. But part of what Chief Jones sought to do is to uncover the kind of history of racist policing within the Stockton Police Department, in order to use as a basis to build trust with communities and to hold listening sessions between rank and file officers and community members. And that's partly where I came in. Chief Jones opened up the records of the Stockton Police Department to me, and I've spent a good deal of 2016 and 17 in Stockton, and try to make it back as frequently as I can, although COVID has made that more difficult. But in helping the police department achieve these reconciliation objectives. And there are a few other officers who are really committed to what's called like fact finding and truth telling, and taking accountability for past harms, whether that's lynching, in the early 20th century, or that's excessive use of force and police brutality in more recent years, and attempting to use history as a tool to improve police community relations. And, all of these reforms in a lot of senses are very limited, but I do think that history is a tool for us that can help us get past and understand the long history of mistrust, and hopefully give officers the tools to recognize the kind of larger socio-economic and political dynamics of what it means to be an officer who's coming in to a low income, most likely community of color as an outside force, and where that is an act in itself that leads to mistrust and fear, really, on both sides between police officers and community members.
Thank you. I want to shift gears towards the question of public protest and violence. And it is another area in which I think history offers us a lot. In the Boston Review in May, you helped unpack the Minneapolis uprising in context. And what you said is, quote, "It can be a struggle to imagine some of the most over-policed, marginalized, and isolated Americans as political actors. And this bias has influenced the writing of history." And I just would love to hear you elaborate on this. I know you did raise that in the talk as well, but how this idea affects public perception of public protest, and also the legacy of Dr. King and nonviolent protest as representative of the model civil rights movement, and kind of how that complicates or people's assessment of an ability, how people judge and perceive violent street protest that turns violent, and whether that's seen as a departure from a more model nonviolent civil rights movement protests of the 60s. And obviously, you just told us these are all part of the same thing, but I know people aren't there. And if you could just help us a little bit more explicitly, what is the role of violence in public protest for social change in this moment for Black Americans seeking justice?
Yeah, that's a really important and tough question. I mean, I think part of why it's important for us to to take those who do feel that that violent forms of protests are the only available means to achieve larger goals, I think is really key because, and this is one of the things I really tried to emphasize in the talk, is that, many that these incidents of rebellion, these incidents of violent political action are rooted in the same set of socioeconomic grievances around employment and housing and education that we associate with the mainstream civil rights movement. And in labeling people who participate in violent forms of protests and dismissing them as criminals or as hoodlums, as Johnson said, we hear the same rhetoric again and again today from President Trump and from people like Senator Tom Cotton in the pages of the New York Times. This isn't going to actually, in labeling this as criminal, which is what we've done historically, this continues to prevent us from actually realizing or identifying what the larger structural forces are that breed this kind of protest in the first place. And one of the things that I think is a really important dynamic of the 60s and also of protests today, the so-called riots, right, were completely dismissed. They were seen as violent and criminal by federal policymakers, and in many ways, even though contrary to a lot of the myths that we tell ourselves, or the kind of dominant interpretation of the rise of federal law enforcement offered by many of my political scientists and sociologist friends, crime was not in 1965 when Johnson called the war on crime was not at an all-time high, as many policymakers at the time would have had people believe. It was that the murder rate in 65 was actually lower than it had been in 1930 and in the early 20th century. The crime that was new were these expressions of collective political violence that end up getting kind of swept up and used to ground greater law enforcement intervention in these communities. And so, had then and now, had we thought and taken seriously the larger conditions that breed and lead people to feel as though they've exhausted other options and that nonviolent protest isn't going to get them ultimately the demands that they're seeking or to bring about the change that they want. We've got to begin to actually listen to people and think differently about how to respond to these forms of protest. One of the things that made 2020 and really the protests from the mid 2010s, beginning with Ferguson onwards, unique is that unlike Watts or Detroit or York, Pennsylvania, that I mentioned in the talk, the more recent violent political protests have all started out as peaceful marches and vigils and end up becoming violent when police show up in riot gear, heavily armed, throwing tear gas at peaceful protesters and things like that. So again, even in response to completely peaceful protests today, law enforcement tends to treat these gatherings, these demonstrations as something that's violent, which in turn ends up precipitating violence among the protesters. So again, this criminalization of protest in general, and the kind of continued criminalization of those who see violent rebellion as the kind of next logical phase of protest to achieve aims that had seemed to be unmet through nonviolent means. We've got to begin to think about differently, and we've got to begin to respond to just like so much of, I kind of sound like a broken record, but we've got to begin to respond to outside of law enforcement and police. And so, continuing to label violent protests as criminal and even peaceful protests as criminal is creates this cycle through which rebellion and the entwined forces of nonviolent and violent protests becomes an enduring feature in the United States.
Well, and I found that such a powerful part of your talk when you offered us the long history of white violent protests being not problematic, some of those kind of vigilante social control efforts just getting tied up and professionalized into the police. And then the Black violent protest becomes criminalized with the rise of the civil rights movement. I just want to shift gears one more again because
Yeah.
I want to talk about the Mellon Project. And so, one of the reasons why we're in this moment is because of mass incarceration, because America disproportionately incarcerates so many people, especially Black and Brown people, and the denial of educational opportunities and job opportunities, as you've explained, at the heart of this whole big web. And, this summer, for people who don't know, the Mellon Foundation announced a $5.3 million program to fund freedom libraries in prisons across the country. Dr. Hinton and the poet and activist Reginald Dwayne Betts will select the books. So I would love to hear why this project is so important and how it's going.
I'm so glad that you asked about this, Jen, especially in a setting such as this, because and I know that this is something that the two of us share. But as scholars who work on, as a scholar who works on these issues, and someone who works at a university, it's really so mass incarceration. We're all complacent in mass incarceration, and it's up to all of us. It's not just about the federal government changing policies. We've all got to, we all have a role to play in getting us out of this mess that we're in. And I think universities have a really, really important role to play in the sense that, and private foundations, in the sense that, more than race, education is a far more important predictor in determining future incarceration. So if you're a white man or woman without a high school degree, you're much more likely to go to prison than a Black person with a high school degree. And so I think as university educators, especially at elite institutions, we really have a responsibility and an opportunity to provide educational opportunities to the least educated in our society. And that's really the group of people who are systematically incarcerated. And it's something that I'm really committed to. That I've at Harvard and here at Yale, I think it's imperative that universities step up to provide educational resources to incarcerated people. And the Mellon Project, it's housed at the Justice Collaboratory at Yale, but it's funded through the Mellon Foundation. And as part of that effort, this was the genius idea of Dwayne Betts, as Jen mentioned. And we intend to, or we will, install basically 500 book mini libraries in prisons and juvenile prisons across the United States. And right now, we're in the process of selecting the books, and they're going to be a wide range of titles, fiction, nonfiction. And we, imagine this not only as, and in part, it's because, it's difficult to get, not all prisons have the resources, and prison authorities, can be hesitant to include a really robust educational programming, especially at the secondary level. So we're trying to provide people with resources and sets of books that they might not have access to in prison libraries, especially since most of the books in prison libraries tend to be like crime novels or romance novels. And we're hoping that that this project will help bring some of the best and more recent titles into prisons to help foster a sense of community among incarcerated people through discussions and through self-education, but also to give people a window into a world in which so many incarcerated people are systematically denied access to.
I thank you for working on that project. When I read the announcement in the New York Times that day, my heart stopped. It was just a moment where I felt like the world is changing. It's amazing. I have one last question, and I
Yeah,
think
sure.
while we're on the topic of education, um, some of our viewers are wondering how we can best support students and other young people who are engaged in social justice activism, who want to be a part of the movement. Perhaps how can we help them get skills to be successful activists, in whatever way that means. We'd love your insights.
Well, there's so many, I mean, there's so many different ways. I think, you know, the first thing that comes to mind is just keeping informed on these topics and knowing our as a historian I'm going to say knowing our history. I think especially in a moment when things like Donald Trump's patriotic education initiative are really trying to rewrite and obscure the history of racial, class, and gender depression in the United States. It's really important that we are aware of these of these histories, and that we support those people who are doing that work. So part of it is to, and this is a project that I think all of us who are committed to social justice engaging in an ongoing basis, just keeping ourselves educated and trying to learn as much about the kind of root causes of a lot of these issues as we can, and then sharing that knowledge with people, and that tends to spread through communities. I think right now it's community organizations and working with community groups, not just on our college campuses, but in the cities where our colleges and universities are located. To me, the movement that's happening within communities is really the future. And so I think, especially in a moment when so many community organizations that are doing important work to foster and promote public safety are so underfunded and understaffed and undersupported. It's really key as we build this movement that it's not just about protesting, which is really important, right? Because that's what puts pressure on our elected officials to actually make the changes that we want to see. But at the same time, it's important that we identify and support those organizations working to advance social justice in our communities, and volunteering our time, donating money, or helping to organize, not as allies and supporters. I think is really important.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was really great.
What really moved me was the emphasis on education and not least history in thinking about all these issues. It's really sort of a great reminder about why lecture series such as these are important, not to speak of all the other, fascinating things you talked about this evening. So thank you so much. A few reminders before we close. If you are a seminar participant, please sign up for a discussion section. You should have gotten an email to remind you to sign up. Thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon and for your engagement in this lecture series. This week, we will have an event linked to the 5th anniversary of the Amherst Uprising. This Thursday at 8 p.m., there will be a session about how the Being Human in STEM initiative came out of the Amherst Uprising. In the spring, we will have a number of lectures sponsored by the President's Office on race and racism. Please stay tuned for these announcements about these events. Thank you again, Professors Hinton and Professor Mannion, and goodbye, everyone. Have a great evening.